What if I told you that Europe's most powerful kings and queens carried within their veins not the strength of empires, but the seeds of their own destruction? Imagine a dynasty so obsessed with keeping blood pure that they unknowingly created monsters of flesh and spirit rulers more broken than blessed. This is not just history, it is a cautionary tale of what happens when human ambition dares to rewrite the laws of nature. And before we begin unraveling these disturbing truths, make sure to hit subscribe, because you are about to discover how royal bloodlines became their own curse. For 300 years, Europe's ruling families practiced a ritual they considered sacred, marrying cousins, nieces, and uncles, in the hope of keeping wealth and power from slipping away. But instead of eternal dominance, what they created were generations of rulers who could barely function as human beings. Behind the golden crowns and silken robes hid bodies so twisted and minds so fractured that even loyal subjects whispered of demonic curses. The story begins with the infamous Habsburg dynasty masters of Europe for centuries, and the architects of their own genetic downfall. They believed that by keeping their marriages within the family, they could preserve not only their fortune, but their divine right to rule. What they preserved instead were mutations, errors, coded into their very blood that multiplied with each generation. The final product of this dangerous experiment was a king who became a living legend of deformity, Charles II of Spain. Charles II was not merely a weak king, he was a spectacle of genetic collapse. After 16 generations of Habsburg cousins marrying cousins, Spain's empire inherited a monarch who looked and behaved less like a man and more like a grotesque echo of centuries of arrogance. His jaw jutted out so far that his teeth never met. He could not chew food like ordinary men. Servants had to grind meals into mush, and even then he often choked, swallowing like a snake forced to devour prey whole. The deformity was not confined to his jaw. Charles drooled constantly, his oversized tongue spilling past lips that could not close. Diplomats attending his court struggled to understand him, his words emerging in garbled mumbles that required interpreters. Imagine a king whose ministers had to guess what their sovereign meant, not because of politics, but because his mouth could not shape words. This was the ruler of the world's largest empire, rendered mute by his own bloodline. Even the most private aspects of his life bore the mark of genetic ruin. Charles married twice, yet neither union produced children. Court physicians described him as utterly incapable of consummation. Remedies ranged from prayers and holy oils to rituals involving witches, for many believed his impotence was the work of sorcery. But the truth was more tragic. No magic could mend what centuries of inbreeding had broken. Worse still, his mind seemed locked in a child's world. Records from the Spanish court describe a monarch who preferred toys to treaties, who pouted and threw tantrums when advisors contradicted him. Political decisions were swayed not by reason, but by whichever courtier offered the most amusing gifts. Foreign ambassadors left meetings bewildered, wondering how Europe's greatest empire had entrusted itself to a man who giggled inappropriately and stared blankly at affairs of state. His body was a battlefield of diseases. Chronic seizures struck without warning, leaving him convulsing on the floor, foam at his lips, while horrified servants scrambled to revive him. His immune system was so weakened that minor colds threatened his life. He suffered constant diarrhea, turning royal processions into humiliating spectacles of foul odors and frantic attendants. A king meant to inspire awe instead inspired pity and disgust. When Charles II finally died in 1700 at only 38 years old, the horror was far from over. His autopsy revealed a body that had been rotting from within. His heart was shriveled to the size of a peppercorn. His lungs corroded black. His kidneys decomposed into sludge, and he possessed only one testicle, shriveled, blackened, useless. The physicians who cut him open declared it a miracle he had lived at all. His corpse was not just the death of a man, but the death sentence of a dynasty. Charles's passing ignited the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that reshaped Europe's map. But behind the cannons and treaties lay a darker truth: the Habsburgs had strangled themselves with their own obsession. Their family tree, once proud and towering, had twisted into a noose. What seemed like a strategy for eternal power had instead become a slow-motion suicide. And Charles II was its final victim, a man remembered not for his reign, but for the curse of his blood. But the curse of royal bloodlines did not die with Charles II. Across Europe, the obsession with keeping crowns and coffers within the family continued to spread its poison. Another monarch, seemingly innocent and grandmotherly in appearance, would become the unwitting carrier of a genetic time bomb that would terrorize courts for generations. Her name was Queen Victoria. Victoria, remembered fondly by many as the grandmother of Europe, hid within her DNA a deadly gift, hemophilia B. This genetic disorder prevents blood from clotting, turning the smallest cut into a slow, dangerous bleed. While Victoria herself showed no symptoms, she was a silent carrier passing the mutation to her children, and from them it seeped into nearly every major royal house of Europe. Victoria's 9 children became pawns in a game of genetic roulette. Each marriage was meant to strengthen alliances, but in truth it smuggled a hidden curse into the veins of princes and princesses. Her daughter Alice carried the disease to Germany. Another daughter, Beatrice, brought it to Spain, and others spread it to Russia and Britain itself. What Victoria saw as diplomacy, history would remember as biological warfare. The impact was devastating. Princes who should have led armies or ruled nations instead lived like fragile glass statues. They bruised easily, bled uncontrollably, and lived in constant fear of the smallest injury. One prince, Leopold, Victoria's own son, lived surrounded by padded furniture, his steps shadowed by anxious attendants, terrified that a stumble on the stairs could mean his death. Court physicians unfamiliar with the rare condition tried medieval treatments that only made things worse. They applied leeches. They bled their patients, never realizing they were draining lives already slipping away. And yet the truth could never be spoken aloud. To admit weakness in a royal family was to admit vulnerability to enemies. And so the courts lied, disguising deaths from internal bleeding as fevers or sudden illness. Official portraits became works of deception. Artists were instructed to paint away bruises to give a glow of health to boys who could barely stand. Public appearances were carefully orchestrated performances, with sickly princes kept out of sight or paraded only under controlled, risk-free conditions. The monarchy itself became a stage, and its heirs the unwilling actors in a play of survival. The cruelest twist was genetic. Hemophilia is carried on the X chromosome, meaning daughters often became silent messengers of death, appearing healthy but dooming their sons. Generations of royals thought the curse had skipped them, only to discover too late that their grandsons were bleeding to death from a scraped knee or a bumped elbow. It was a cycle of hope and despair, endlessly repeating. By the early 20th century, hemophilia had spread like wildfire through the royal families of Europe. Britain, Germany, Russia, Spain, none were spared. The curse had traveled faster and more ruthlessly than any army, weakening dynasties precisely when they needed strength to face revolutions and wars. And all of it could be traced back to one grandmotherly figure who never knew the secret buried in her blood. Nowhere did this curse strike more tragically than in Russia. In 1904, the long-awaited male heir of the Romanov dynasty, Alexei, was born. His arrival was supposed to secure the future of an empire. Instead, it became the empire's undoing. Within months, it was clear that the boy had inherited hemophilia. Each fall, each bruise carried the weight of doom. Alexei's episodes were described in whispers as torture. His joints swelled grotesquely with internal bleeding, his screams echoing through palace halls while his desperate parents watched helplessly. Doctors stood powerless. Courtiers spread rumors, and in the shadows, a mysterious peasant named Rasputin entered the stage, a man who, for reasons still debated, seemed able to ease the boy's suffering. His arrival would turn a medical curse into a political catastrophe. Rasputin was no ordinary healer. To some, he was a holy man, to others a fraud, but to the desperate Romanovs, he was salvation. Whether it was hypnosis, calming words, or simply coincidence, his presence seemed to stop Alexei's bleeding crises. This gave him a power few commoners in history had ever held influence over the most powerful family in Russia. The Tsarina Alexandra clung to him like a lifeline. Each time Alexei writhed in agony, she turned to Rasputin, and when the boy improved, her faith deepened. Soon, Rasputin was not merely a guest in the palace, he was its shadowy master. He whispered advice on politics, demanded favors, and exploited his position to indulge his appetites, all while cloaking himself in a veneer of mysticism. The Russian court became a theater of whispers and suspicion. Ministers questioned why state decisions seemed tied to a peasant mystic. Foreign ambassadors reported with alarm that Russia's empire was being guided by a man reeking of alcohol, boasting of conquests not on the battlefield but in bedrooms. The monarchy's image, already fragile, began to collapse under the weight of scandal. Behind closed doors, the Romanovs built a fortress of secrecy. Official photographs of Alexei were staged to hide his bruises and swelling. In public, the boy was treated like fragile porcelain, protected from games and movements that might injure him. Yet the truth could not be contained forever. Rumors swirled through St. Petersburg like smoke, feeding a growing sense that dark forces controlled the throne. By the time World War I engulfed Russia, the dynasty was rotting from within. Soldiers died in the trenches while newspapers hinted at Rasputin's influence. Revolutionaries whispered that the monarchy was cursed, that its blood was corrupted. And when the revolution finally came, it struck with a fury sharpened by years of secrecy and lies. In July 1918, the Romanov family was led to a basement under the pretense of safety. What awaited them was execution. Bullets and bayonets ended 3 centuries of rule in a storm of violence. Among the dead was Alexei, the boy whose fragile bloodline had opened the door to revolution. The tragedy was complete. A genetic condition had helped topple one of history's greatest empires. And yet the irony lingers like a cruel joke. Today, hemophilia can be managed with simple injections of clotting factors. The pain, the secrecy, the political collapse, it could all have been avoided. But in the early 20th century, one genetic defect became a fault line that shattered the Russian crown and shook the world. The curse of bloodlines did not stop in Russia. In Britain, another king would reveal how genetic inheritance could destroy not just the body but the mind. His name was George III, remembered in history books as the Mad King. But his madness was not merely psychological, it was chemical. A storm brewed within his very blood. Modern analysis suggests George suffered from porphyria, a genetic disorder that poisoned his body from the inside. Attacks came without warning, stabbing pains in the abdomen muscles, weakening to the point of paralysis, and most horrifying of all, hallucinations that dragged him into worlds of terror. His urine turned purple. His speech became nonsense, and his mood swung between rage and despair. The timing could not have been worse. His first major breakdown came in 1765, just as tensions with America were reaching a boiling point. Instead of compromise, the king's poisoned brain pushed him toward stubbornness and fury. Colonists seeking reasonable concessions found themselves negotiating with a monarch lost in the haze of his own illness. The result was history itself, the birth of the American Revolution. As George's episodes worsened, his court descended into chaos. Ministers whispered about his violent rages, his endless monologues with invisible companions, his belief that London was flooded, or that he himself had spoken with the dead. Servants restrained him in straitjackets. Physicians subjected him to ice baths and blistering agents treatments as medieval as the illness itself. In 1788, his collapse became impossible to conceal. Parliament debated openly whether the king was insane and whether his son should take the throne as regent. The fate of the British Empire balanced on the question of a monarch's sanity. Foreign spies reported gleefully on his condition, and Napoleon himself dismissed Britain as a nation ruled by a madman. The tragedy of George III is not only that he suffered, but that his suffering reshaped global history. His genetic illness may have hardened his refusal to compromise with American colonists, accelerating their rebellion. A defect hidden in his blood may have contributed to the very birth of the United States. In this sense, the revolution was not only political, it was biological. By the end of his life, George was a prisoner in his own mind. Blind, deaf, and raving, he wandered his palace in delusion, speaking to ghosts and reliving memories decades old. A king who had ruled the world's greatest empire, who had faced Napoleon and presided over a global power, ended his days in madness, undone by the same royal obsession with bloodlines that had crippled the Habsburgs and doomed the Romanovs. But Britain was not alone in its genetic tragedies. Across the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal's royal family faced a disaster that was not visible in bones or blood, but in the fragile architecture of the mind. Queen Maria, remembered as Mad Maria, began her reign as a capable ruler, only to descend into religious mania that turned her palace into a house of screams. At first, her devotion seemed like piety, but soon prayers turned into obsessions and faith into terror. She believed demons stalked her chambers, that eternal damnation awaited her, that every minor mistake doomed her soul. Courtiers reported hearing her shrieks echoing through the palace at night, convinced she was already living in hell. Her breakdown did not happen in isolation. Generations of intermarriage with the Spanish royal family itself, poisoned by Habsburg blood, had created a feedback loop of fragile minds. Her son, José, showed signs of severe depression. Her grandson, Miguel, erupted in violent rages. Madness had become hereditary, written into the Portuguese crown like a curse passed from throne to throne. Maria's illness worsened after Europe convulsed with revolution. The execution of her nephew Louis XVI of France shattered her already delicate psyche. She screamed for hours, refused to sign documents, and interrupted council meetings with frantic sermons. Ambassadors wrote home that Portugal was effectively leaderless, its queen a corpse that walked and wailed. By 1799, she was declared unfit to rule. Her son, João, became regent, but the damage to Portugal was irreversible. Political paralysis weakened the kingdom during the Napoleonic Wars. Brazil. Portugal's richest colony was lost forever. Madness had not only consumed a queen, it had consumed her empire. The lesson of Portugal's tragedy was stark. Royal inbreeding did not only twist bones and clot blood, it could also unravel the mind. Where the Habsburgs wore deformity on their faces and the Romanovs spilled their lifeblood onto palace floors, the Portuguese revealed the invisible horror mental illness amplified by generations of genetic isolation. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe's royal courts were haunted by shadows of their own making. From the grotesque jaws of the Habsburgs to the bleeding princes of Victoria's line, from the madness of George III to the screams of Maria Theresa, the pattern was undeniable. Power preserved through inbreeding came at the cost of humanity itself. And yet the marriages continued. The logic was always the same: keep the crown safe, keep the fortune within, keep the dynasty untouchable. But in truth, every wedding was another stitch in the family's genetic shroud, weaving a tapestry of weakness and doom. What began as ambition transformed into an unspoken death pact. Consider the Habsburgs once more. Their fixation on pure blood became a kind of state religion, a belief so strong it blinded them to the collapse unfolding in their very palaces. Courtiers who should have spoken out remained silent, unwilling to risk treason by pointing to the obvious. And so Charles II grew up surrounded not by truth, but by ceremony, by the lie that he was whole. The irony was brutal. Monarchs who imagined themselves as God's chosen representatives on earth had, by their own choices, created rulers who looked cursed by hell itself. The people whispered of witches, devils, and dark magic, yet the real sorcery was human arrogance generation after generation, believing they could bend nature to their will. Science would later explain what superstition could not. Inbreeding collapses genetic diversity, increasing the chance of hidden defects surfacing. What was once recessive becomes dominant. What might have remained harmless becomes deadly. The royal families had essentially turned their bloodlines into laboratories of failure, breeding not strength but fragility. The medical horrors were only part of the story. Politics twisted under the weight of sickly rulers. Charles II's incapacity invited foreign manipulation. Rasputin's influence in Russia grew only because Alexei's illness created desperation. George III's madness reshaped British policy toward America. Maria Thist's breakdown left Portugal vulnerable to Napoleon. The defects in their bodies reshaped the destinies of nations. This is why the story of royal inbreeding is more than a tale of deformity. It is a story of how private suffering becomes public catastrophe. A weak heir meant unstable government. A mad monarch meant uncertain policy. The genetic gamble of dynasties spilled far beyond palace walls. It shaped wars, revolutions, and the map of Europe itself. By the early 20th century, the tragedies could no longer be ignored. Hemophilia had spread through royal houses like wildfire. Madness had become too obvious to disguise, and the age of thrones ruled by broken bodies was drawing to a close. Yet the damage was already done. Dynasties that had lasted centuries were swept aside by revolutions, their fragile heirs no match for the anger of nations. The First World War was the final nail in the coffin. Cousins who shared not only blood but also defects went to war against each other, leading nations into industrial slaughter, while their own veins carried the weakness of centuries. The royal obsession with purity had left them brittle, and when modernity arrived with fire and steel, they shattered. And so, by the mid-20th century, Europe's royal families quietly abandoned the very obsession that had defined them. No longer could they afford to marry only cousins and nieces. Commoners entered the bloodlines not by revolution, but by necessity. It was survival. The lesson had been paid for in centuries of deformity, disease, and madness, and at last the crowns could no longer ignore it. Modern science, with its microscopes and genetic sequencing, would later confirm what history had already written in blood. The royal families of Europe had engineered their own collapse. By restricting love and marriage to the narrow circle of cousins, they had chosen power over health and legacy over life. The cost was visible in every twisted jaw, every bleeding child, every monarch lost to madness. Even today, scientists still study the remains of these rulers. DNA from the bones of Charles II and other Habsburgs continues to reveal how inbreeding magnifies hidden mutations. What was once whispered in fear about curses and devils is now charted in chromosomes and alleles. The ghosts of Europe's royal courts live on not in haunted palaces but in laboratories and textbooks, and yet numbers and science alone cannot capture the horror. Imagine the silence of a royal nursery, where a child bleeds from a simple bruise and attendants can do nothing but pray. Imagine the echoing halls of a palace where a queen shrieks at invisible demons. Imagine the empty eyes of a king who rules the world's mightiest empire but cannot chew a bite of bread. These are the true images of royal inbreeding. What makes these stories haunting is not only their grotesque details, but their inevitability. Once the first marriages were made within the family, the cycle was almost impossible to break. Each generation believed it could escape the curse only to pass it deeper into the bloodline. In this sense, the real tragedy was not just genetic, it was human denial, the refusal to see what was unfolding in plain sight. But history has a cruel way of teaching lessons. The fall of Spain's power, the Russian Revolution, the loss of America, the decline of Portugal, all of these political earthquakes were linked in part to the weakness of royal bodies and minds. Thrones were not lost on the battlefield alone. They were lost in the sick rooms of palaces, in the fragile veins of heirs, in the madness of monarchs. And what of the people ruled by these broken dynasties? Subjects who starved, soldiers who died, nations that collapsed, all paid the price for a handful of families obsessed with keeping their blood pure. The irony is as sharp as it is cruel in trying to keep their crowns secure. The royals made their empires fatally insecure. By the 20th century, the pattern had become too obvious to ignore. The British royal family began marrying outside the aristocracy. Other dynasties followed suit, introducing healthy diversity back into their lines. Slowly, the grotesque jaws, the fragile veins, and the haunted minds faded into the background. The age of royal genetic disasters came to a reluctant end, but the legacy remains etched into portraits preserved in records and remembered in whispers. Every time we look at a painting of Charles II with his heavy jaw, or read the desperate letters of Alexandra begging Rasputin to save her son, or study the medical notes on George III's madness, we are reminded of the price of arrogance. These rulers became symbols not of divine right, but of human fragility. They reveal how power, when hoarded and worshipped, can rot from the inside out. The thrones were gilded, the crowns studded with jewels, but the bodies that wore them were riddled with disease. In every glittering court there lurked an invisible curse, carried not by demons, but by DNA. And so the story of royal inbreeding is more than grotesque anecdotes. It is a warning, carved into history, that no empire, however mighty, can defy the laws of nature forever. The Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Tudors, the Braganzas, all learned this truth in the hardest possible way. Their downfall was not written in prophecy or superstition, but in their very blood. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that these kings and queens were not monsters by choice. They were victims of a system that worshipped bloodlines more than humanity. Yet, in the eyes of their subjects, their deformities and breakdowns became symbols of divine punishment, proof that arrogance invites ruin. Every twisted face and haunted mind was a mirror held up to an empire's pride. Charles II of Spain, unable to eat without choking, became the emblem of a dynasty strangled by its own choices. His body was a grotesque monument to the dangers of inbreeding his reign, a slow-motion tragedy. He was not cursed by demons, but by the pride of ancestors who believed they could trap power within veins of gold. Queen Victoria, so often painted as a maternal figure, unknowingly turned her children into weapons of genetic destruction. Her hemophilia gene traveled across Europe like an invisible army, bleeding princes to death and toppling crowns. She reminds us that even the gentlest-seeming rulers can leave legacies steeped in silent horror. Alexei Romanov's suffering echoes louder than the gunfire that ended his family's reign. His cries of pain, carried through the halls of the Alexander Palace, were the soundtrack of an empire's collapse. And Rasputin's rise from peasant mystic to political manipulator shows how desperation for survival can open doors to chaos. George II's madness reveals another lesson, that the fate of nations can pivot on the fragile chemistry of a single mind. His illness may have steered Britain toward intransigence, fueling revolution across the Atlantic. The independence of America, one of history's greatest shifts may owe part of its spark to a king's poisoned blood. Maria Thury's screams in the palaces of Portugal remind us that the mind too can be destroyed by generations of insularity. Her shrieks of terror at invisible demons were not merely personal torment. They became the soundtrack of a nation's decline. Portugal's weakness in the Napoleonic era was not only military, it was psychological, rooted in the collapse of its crown. Together, these stories form a tapestry of warning. They show us how private suffering and public power intertwine, how the sickness of one body can ripple outward to shape millions of lives. They remind us that history is not only battles and treaties, but also genes and blood bodies and minds. And while today's royals no longer live under the same obsession with purity, the lesson reaches beyond palaces. It speaks to any system that clings too tightly to its own myths, that confuses preservation with stagnation, that values appearance over reality. The downfall may not come through armies, but through slow internal rot. The real curse was never supernatural. It was human arrogance, the belief that crowns could defy nature, that power could override biology, that dynasties could outwit time itself. The kings and queens who suffered were not only rulers, they were living warnings, their bodies telling truths their courts tried desperately to hide. So, when we look back at the portraits of swollen jaws, pale princes, and haunted eyes, we are not just peering into the past. We are staring at the cost of ambition, unrestrained of power, turned inward until it consumed itself. Remember their stories, because history has a way of repeating when its warnings go unheeded. And if you want to uncover more of these unsettling truths hidden behind the crowns, make sure to subscribe. Our journey into the dark side of history is only just beginning.